In today's lesson, the prophet Micah reveals the future. That is, he foretells. And Micah foresees not just one event, but two in this passage of Scripture, both of which seemed outlandish and impossible to the people he addressed in his day. For us today, one of those events foretold by Micah is history. What God's prophet predicted occurred as foreseen in every detail. It seemed impossible at the time, but nevertheless, the words God put in his prophet's mouth came true precisely. The other event he foretold is yet to happen. It still seems outlandish and impossible to most human beings living today, but to us Christians, we understand the truth in this statement. Nothing is impossible for God. I need to modify that statement just a bit. For the Bible teaches that there is indeed one thing that is impossible for God to do. One thing and only one thing is impossible for our God. Do you know what that one thing is? That which is totally impossible for God to do? Not that he won't do it. I'm not talking about that. There are plenty of things God could do but doesn't do because he chooses not to. No, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18 clearly states that God cannot do this one thing. What's amazing about it is that you and I can do it. Many of us do it daily without even thinking about it, but God cannot do it. What is it that is impossible for God to do that is easy for us humans to do? Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18 tells us, "It is impossible for God to lie." We who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to hold firmly to the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and reliable, and one which enters within the veil where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us. God cannot lie. To my knowledge, there is only one verse in the Bible that indicates God is incapable of doing something. That's this one. Hebrews 6:18 states emphatically that it is impossible for God to lie. And that is the anchor for our soul, for without the truth we find in the Scriptures, what hope have we? Now, bear all that in mind as we take a look at two promises of future events that Micah, speaking on behalf of God, declared some 7 centuries ago. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills. Peoples will stream to it, and many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways, so we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." That phrase that opens this chapter, "in the last days," is an interesting one. In the last days refers to a time in the future when our Prince of Peace will reign over his perfect kingdom. It is a day Christians like you and I are looking forward to, for the Prince of Peace is Jesus Christ. He will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war. A portion of this verse is inscribed on the United Nations building in New York City. It reads, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares." But they left off a part of that verse, and it's the important part. For what they omitted tells why the nations will be able to turn their weapons of war to useful tools for peace. Because he will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. When that hopeful person inscribed those words on the UN building about beating their swords into plowshares, he pulled it out of context. When he did that, he omitted not only why the nations can turn their weapons of war to tools for peace, but also when it will happen and who will be the judge rendering those rightful decisions. The who is the God of Jacob. The when is when many nations say, "Come and let's go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob." If the mission of the United Nations is to unite the nations and bring peace to the world, let's face it, that hasn't happened in a meaningful way. Despite the United Nations' ongoing efforts, world peace has never come to stay. That won't be possible until people from around the globe first recognize the God of Jacob. There will be no true peace until the Prince of Peace returns. He will then make all things new and rule over us from his throne in Jerusalem. At that time, weapons of war will be turned into useful tools that can help feed the world. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning knives. But it is hard for us to even imagine a day when nations will no longer go to war against one another. The end of war? Really? Humans have tried to put an end to it. World War I, which began in 1914 and lasted 4 long and bitter years, was said to be the war to end all wars. We all know how that turned out. Not 2 decades after the First World War came to a close, another opened up. Humans were at it again, trying to kill each other. Surely World War II would settle things once and for all. That's what our parents and grandparents hoped. But the Second World War ended with the introduction of a weapon that is capable of destroying all humankind. Today, the number of nuclear warheads throughout the world is estimated to be about 14,000. When nations are building nuclear warheads, it seems a fairy tale that a day will arrive when men will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning knives. But as John Lennon sang, imagine all the people living life in peace. Now, I wouldn't suggest that John Lennon was a prophet of God, but in this case, he got it right. That day is coming. This is what the God who cannot lie says that humans can expect one day in the future. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, because the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. Though all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Obviously, it's an era that hasn't arrived quite yet. Whenever the world makes a little progress toward that goal of world peace, something happens that sets us back. Just when the international community was beginning to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, the escalation of tensions between Russia and Ukraine resulted in an invasion by Russian troops into its neighbor, and so emerged yet another armed conflict in Europe. I hope and pray this one doesn't lead to a third world war. The Russian defense minister claimed this last September that only 5,937 Russian soldiers have died in the war with Ukraine. But U.S. Army General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he estimates that more than 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this war. He also says that Ukraine has suffered a similar number of casualties. If that's so, that's 200,000 total. 200,000 and counting killed or wounded in a senseless war. And everyone is holding their breath just hoping that Russia will not unleash its nuclear arsenal in this conflict. So try as we might as human beings, it doesn't look as though our efforts to end war is going to happen anytime soon. In addition to the war in Ukraine, there are today at least 14 additional wars happening around the globe. Thousands are dying in wartime on a daily basis. These wars occur for a variety of reasons, of course. You don't go to war without a reason. But who cares what the reason is? People are dying. What a waste. The good news is this: a time of world peace is coming. God promised through his prophet Micah. Here's how Micah describes that coming period of peace and prosperity. On that day, this is the Lord's declaration: I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation. Then the Lord will rule over them in Mount Zion from this time on and forever. And you, watchtower for the flock, fortified hill of daughter Zion, the former rule will come to you, sovereignty will come to daughter Jerusalem. You notice that Micah says this is the Lord's declaration, almost as if he knows no one will believe him when he makes this prediction. The Lord's declaration is this: God will once again rule over his creation. Imagine a day when it will be just as it was in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, described in Genesis. It will be a time of peace for us as it was then, when God walked with and talked with his human creation. The Prince of Peace will live among us. Sounds wonderful, but why should we believe it? Why should we believe a man named Micah, who some 29 centuries ago declared that a time of peace and prosperity is coming to the world? A time when Yahweh himself, the God of Jacob and Israel, will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. A time when each man will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him. A time when people the world over will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning knives. A time when we will walk in the name of Yahweh our God forever and ever. Why should we believe any of that? It sounds like the stuff dreams are made of. It seems impossible to us. Throughout our human history, any such period of peace always comes to an end. Somebody is always going to war with someone somewhere. So why should we believe an ancient prophet who tells us that an era of world peace and prosperity is coming? Well, I can give you two reasons. The first is because it is God telling us so. I already covered this. God cannot lie. And here Micah isn't speaking as a mere man. He is speaking as a prophet of God. God uses the lips of Micah to speak directly to us. Micah's words are God's words, and God cannot lie. So if God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. But not everyone believes in God. What if you don't believe what the Bible says? What if you think God himself is a myth and that the Word of God is just a book of history mixed with fables? And that brings us to reason number 2 why you can believe what Micah says. You see, here is truth. Historians assert that the pages printed in our Bible agree for the most part with history recorded elsewhere. The events told in the Bible were recorded long ago, in centuries long past, by a variety of men. These men related what they observed. They told of events that occurred during their lifetimes or based on the verbal and written histories recorded by others. And that is what all historians have always done. Even if unbelievers look at the book of Micah as little more than a history book, they will find that there is evidence right there within Micah, within chapter 4, evidence that demonstrates that this man somehow, inexplicably, could indeed predict the future. For what Micah predicts in chapter 4 about our future of peace and prosperity probably seems no less likely to us today than what Micah predicted to the Israelites living in the 7th century BC. My guess is that the people of Micah's day surely thought that he was full of hooey. They may have laughed at him, because just listen to what he told them. Now why are you shouting loudly? Is there no king with you? Has your counselor perished so that anguish grips you like a woman in labor? Writhe and cry out, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you will leave the city and camp in the open fields. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the power of your enemies. They surely thought Micah was full of hooey, because there was never a time when the Israelites had no king, not since King Saul was crowned. I can just see the people in Micah's day rolling their eyes when they heard him declare that they would have no king. And then he said, "You will go to Babylon?" What's that all about? Babylon was no world power when Micah spoke these words. I suspect that few Israelites had even heard of them. And yet the same prophet of God who promises an era of world peace and prosperity was telling them that this nation they hadn't even heard of was coming to haul them away into captivity. You will go to Babylon, he said. Many nations have now assembled against you. They say, let her be defiled, and let us feast our eyes on Zion." They may have laughed at Micah when he made this prediction, but about 100 years after he made that statement, in 586 BC, all that Micah foretold occurred. You see, during those 100 years, from the time Micah made the prediction to the date it came true, Babylon had grown to become a powerful nation. They occupied all of Assyria, as well as most of the nations that surrounded Judah. Micah predicted the end of the kings of Israel and Judah. This was a ridiculous statement at the time it was made in the minds of the people, because they thought their kingdom would last forever. And after all, didn't God himself bring them out of captivity in Egypt and plant them in Samaria? He most certainly did. But after they entered the promised land, they drifted far from God. They followed the so-called gods of the heathens they were supposed to drive out. They cast bronze cows, covered them with gold, and bowed down to them. Every generation that passed from the day they entered the promised land, they drifted further from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, through Micah, God warned them of their pending doom. They would be captured by a nation so small at the time that few had even heard of them, Babylon. They would be enslaved once again. If chapter 4 ended here, it would be a pretty miserable future foretold by God's prophet. But there's more. God was no fan of the atrocities being committed in Babylon. Among them were child sacrifice and ritual prostitution. God had this to say to Israel about the Babylonians. "Many nations have now assembled against you. They say, 'Let her be defiled, and let us feast our eyes on Zion.' But they do not know the Lord's intentions or understand his plan, that he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. Rise and thresh, daughter Zion, for I will make your horns iron and your hooves bronze, so you can crush many peoples. Then you will set apart their plunder to the Lord for destruction, their wealth to the Lord of all the earth." As always, God had a plan. He would punish his people for worshiping other gods, then use the enslaved Israelites to rise up and destroy Babylon. The horns of iron mentioned symbolize Israel's strength, the bronze hooves their swiftness and ability to trample over their enemies. Many of us alive today have witnessed the might of tiny Israel against more powerful enemies. In June 1967, Egypt had mobilized its military along its border with Israel. They were prepped for an invasion. So, Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against the Egyptian airfields. Egyptian forces were caught by surprise, and nearly all of Egypt's aerial assets were destroyed. Their jet aircraft and bombers were obliterated on the ground, giving Israel the advantage of air supremacy. So, Egypt withdrew. By the 6th day of the conflict, the war was over, and Israel occupied the entire Sinai Peninsula. Similar examples of Israel's willingness to defend itself have happened since 1967. It always makes the news when they defend themselves. It's clear that God has not departed from his promise to be with the descendants of Abraham. The prophet Micah predicted that Babylon of Assyria would destroy the land of Judah and carry away its king and its people. He promised that at some future point in time, God would help them rise up to defeat their enemy and return to their land. "Rise and thresh, daughter Zion," God declared, "for I will make your horns iron and your hooves bronze, so you can crush many peoples." What should we get from all of this? First, I think, is that God is one who cannot lie. He therefore keeps his promises, all his promises. And so we know that there is coming a day of unimaginable peace and prosperity. Why? Because God said so. God spoke those promises through his prophet Micah and others. The Bible is filled with prophecies of a coming age, of a time when war will be utterly unknown. Not a single armament plant will be in operation. Not a soldier or a sailor will be in uniform. No military camps will exist, and not one penny will be spent on weapons of war. That sounds pretty good to me. The day is coming when all nations will be at peace. All the resources of the world will be available for doing good, and all industry will be engaged in supplying the needs and the desires of human beings. And best of all, Jesus will sit upon the throne and rule over us. Righteousness will prevail. I, for one, am looking forward to that. Aren't you? I'm Rich Musler, Bible teacher and Christian author. Thanks for studying the Bible with me today. Lord willing, I'll see you next week.